Welcome back to Teaching Through the Bible as we continue through the book of Leviticus. We've already gone through a large section of this. Over here we've got sacrifices in the first 10 chapters. Then we've got the cleanness and uncleanness in 11 through 15, the Day of Atonement, the pinnacle, the middle of the book. And then we are now in the section in chapters, really most of the rest of the book, all but the last chapter, chapters 17 through 26, that's all about holiness. And we started that last video, and so we're continuing that now. We're going to get all but the last couple chapters of that. So we're going to work through chapters 21 through 24 today. And as we start out in these chapters, the first two chapters we have here, chapters 21 and 22, are pretty straightforward for the most part. Generally, it's saying, here's how the priests need to be, and here's how the sacrifices need to be, and basically they need to be perfect. What they are, what they look like, how they're represented, it's representing perfection. And of course, none of these people are perfect. They're all sinners. But the things that they do, the ways that they are, they can't be in any way defective. Hunchback, for example, having some kind of disease, for example. So some of these things are things that are never going to change. Some of these things maybe are temporary, some of the sicknesses. But these are all things that would not have been the case in a perfect world, back what we had in Genesis 1 and 2. And so these are things where God's saying, I need the priest to be representing perfection. And they're never going to do it, not perfectly. But this points to the one that they need, Jesus. Jesus does perfectly, morally show perfection, show sinlessness. And so these guys, they're kind of more physically showing. This is a symbolism pointing to someone who would be morally perfect. And we see that with the priests in chapter 21. We see that continue in chapter 22 until we get to the sacrifices, which also need to be representatively perfect. So they can't have blemishes on them. They can't, the animals, they can't be sickly. You can't just say, all right, well, this thing is going to die pretty soon too anyway, so I'll just go ahead and sacrifice that as my offering to God. No, you can't do that. You got to give him the best. There is one little difference with some of the sacrifices where some of those sacrifices are required sacrifices. You did this thing, so you got to give the sacrifice. But there's also some sacrifices aren't mandatory. Some of them are totally free offerings. You just have the free choice to do this. And with particular ones of those sacrifices, there's a little bit of wiggle room where it says, you may, and this is verse 23 of chapter 22, you may present a bull or a lamb that has a part too long or too short for a freewill offering. But for a vow offering, it cannot be accepted. So if it's got like a stunted leg or something like that, then God allows that for this very particular kind of voluntary offering. The big point here is holiness is being set apart. It's being set apart from imperfection. And that's pointing us to needing to be spiritually set apart, wanting us to be perfect in a moral sense. And as we look through these two chapters, while they're mostly pretty clear, I think, as far as what the point is, there's a couple verses that are a little bit odd. Chapter 22, verse 27, when an ox or sheep or goat is born, it shall remain 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable as a food offering to Yahweh. But you shall not kill an ox or a sheep and her young in 1 day. So the 7 days and then the 8th day is when it's considered able to be sacrificed. It's kind of interesting how it seems to maybe parallel a male human child born on the 8th day is circumcised, and that's a representative showing of being clean. There's this idea of it's not a clean, acceptable sacrifice until the 8th day. As for not sacrificing a mother and her child, a sheep and the baby lamb on the same day, they're going to the land of Canaan. And the land of Canaan, there were sacrifices that were they were sacrifices for fertility. And so they would do these sorts of sacrifices to their fake gods, and God does not want his people being any part of that. So that's kind of banning them from idol worship. But then we move on to chapter 23, chapter 24. So chapter 23, it's these feasts. You have all of these feasts, these celebrations. Now, it's not 100% feasts. You also see the Day of Atonement in there, which we've just gone over. But obviously this is a much shorter form. It's one of many of these holy days, or holidays, you could say. It mentions having these Sabbath days in addition to the weekly Sabbath. It'll have some other special days like that in these other in these feasts. So you kind of have that as a building block that kind of is put into the rest of these, like Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Passover is on one day, and then the immediately following that you have a week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I'll put a link in the description below because I've talked about these before back when I went over Exodus, where this was established. And so you have that feast, followed by, later on, the Feast of First Fruits. So first fruits is literally the fruits that are first. They come out first from the ground. So when you have a crop, the first stuff that is ready to be picked, the first stuff that's ripe, that gets dedicated to God as what's called the first fruits. Now this is in a literal sense, fruits that are first, but this comes to mean basically giving the best. And so you'll see this other times in the Bible. We'll talk about something being the first fruits, and it's not literally fruit that is first from the ground. It just means it's the best. The first fruits are representative for what is to come. And as soon as the first fruits do come, you know there's more coming. Paul actually uses an argument that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he wasn't the firstborn from the dead, then we can't know that we will rise from the dead. It's because he's done that already. He's the first one, and now we know that will continue with us who follow him. Then we have the Feast of Weeks. Now this is actually the feast that they were celebrating in Acts, beginning of Acts, in the New Testament. That's Pentecost. So we call it Pentecost. That was called the Feast of Weeks. And so that's kind of cool just to see the continuity between Old and New Testament there. When we're looking at these different feasts, we see these measurements, right? Let's address the measurements, because we haven't done that yet and can't get through Leviticus without addressing these measurements, particularly a hin, and we have the hin and the ephah. Hin is the equivalent of this right here. It's about 1.5 gallons. So I've got a gallon of milk here and like half gallon apple juice. This is a hin, roughly speaking. And this didn't say a full hin. Notice it's a fourth of a hin. So 1/4 of this is how much each of those would have been. And ephah is a little harder to quantify, especially because it's a dry measurement. So with a hin, it's for the oil. It's a liquid measurement. That's pretty standard as far as how much space that's going to take up. But it's not the same with an ephah, because dry measurement depends on what kind of product it is, as far as how big it's going to be, what the volume is going to be. So you could maybe think of it as somewhere between 5 and 10 gallons. This is 1.5 gallons. So maybe here's one, so like 5 times this to maybe 10 times this. Or if you're watching this in a place outside of America, 1.5 gallons right here. This is going to be about 5.7 liters. 5.7 liters. So hopefully that gives you some kind of idea if you're interested in what that sacrifice looked like. Then moving on from the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, you get this Feast of Trumpets. Now the Feast of Trumpets follow, and then the Day of Atonement. These are on the 7th month, the first day, and then the 7th month, the 10th day. We already talked about Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur. We'll have a link to Yom Kippur, that video below, like I said, because I talked about that a couple of videos ago. But then the Feast of Trumpets, there's not a lot about this, but it's basically the new year in a way. So later on, it came to be known as Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh is head, Hashanah, that's the year, so head of the year. So basically New Year. This Feast of Trumpets was something that kind of ushered in a new agricultural year. So in a way, it was a new year, and so it gets this term for a new year. And you can see these on some of the calendars. So I got a calendar here, and we have this. In this case, it's in October. Last year it was closer to the end of September because they don't have the 365-day calendar. They had a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar. So their days that it's on kind of fluctuate. But Rosh Hashanah, on this one, it's October the 2nd this year. And then 10 days later, you have Yom Kippur. So you can see those on your calendars. You can kind of see a bit of this biblical history still there that's celebrated by Jewish people, and you see that on the calendars. So with the Feast of Trumpets, you have something new. It's a new start, a new year, new agricultural year, and we need something new, right? Jesus is the one who renews us, who brings us new life, just like they have their new year of agriculture, and so we can kind of see Jesus typified here as they celebrate a new year, and they need new life, which of course they can only get through the Day of Atonement. And that Day of Atonement is also, again, it's pointing at how they have that new life. It's Jesus. It's Jesus sacrificing himself as the goat, as I talked about in my video on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And so you've got the Day of Atonement next. You've got the Feast of Booths. Feast of Booths is going to be pretty much, they're celebrating the Exodus. Right now, they are in Leviticus. They are encamped around the tabernacle, the tent for God, where he dwells, right? Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tabernacles, it's called, or just Feast of Tents, basically. The feast where they are remembering, they're later on, when they celebrate this, going to remember what's going on right now. That they have gone through the Exodus out of Egypt into the wilderness. God's with them in the wilderness in tents as they go to the Promised Land. So that's going to remind them. They're basically going to camp out. They celebrate they get some stuff to go live out in tents for a little while. So they're reminded of where they came from, of this history of God's miraculous work while they were in the wilderness, which they don't know it yet, but it's going to be quite a long time. So after that wraps up chapter 23, and then we get to 24, which is not on feast. It's on lamps and the bread in the tabernacle. And so which ties in some to the Feast of Booths, because we had this Feast of Booths. It's talking about there's these tents, right? And the main tent is the tabernacle, and of course, ultimately, Jesus is that tabernacle. Jesus is the one who dwells with his people, and he mentions that, especially Gospel according to John. And but the lamp that's in the tabernacle, the bread that's in the tabernacle, we've talked about this back in Exodus. I can send another link below to that so you guys can see more about how that all points to Jesus, but that's all brought up before going to something that's quite different in that it's narrative. Why do we have this narrative here? And we'll get to that in a second, but I want to address real quick right before that, the thing that ends this chapter is an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that passage. So, whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. This is verse 17. Okay? So verse 18, whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Now, this is something where we see this eye for eye. It's probably a phrase you've heard. And a lot of people look at it negatively. Like you get revenge on someone. That's kind of how it's interpreted. But that is incorrect. That's not actually what it's going for here. Now, if you have kids, then surely you will notice this. But even if you don't, you probably will understand that people, when they get revenge, they don't do eye for eye, right? They do like eye for whole face, something like that. If one of my kids were to knock over someone else's Lego set, then is that other kid going to go over and knock over a Lego set, or more likely just shove the first kid and it escalates. It just keeps going. It doesn't stay at the same level it was at. Now, this is a command that keeps that escalation in check. You can't, someone, if someone bumps into you, you can't be like, all right, well, I'm going to kill you. Like, you can't do that. This is something that keeps it from escalating. But not only that, it still wouldn't be right if one of my kids pushes over the second kid's Lego set and the second kid comes back and pushes over the first kid's Lego set. That's still not even what this is talking about, because this is being not told at an individual level. This is a command where these are laws that need to be followed and implemented through the legal system. Back in Exodus, there were judges. There were leaders that were put in place for these sorts of things. And so they've actually got this system already set up. So this is something where the judge makes the determination. So this isn't personal vengeance. This is when someone comes and says, hey, this guy did this to me, then now the judge has a way to understand, okay, well, here's what the ramification is. It's got to be basically equal opposite. That is true justice. But a lot of people don't take it that way. A lot of people kind of just assume, oh, it means this, or that. So just keeping that in context of what this is actually referring to. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth is basically just justice. That's what it is. It's an equal and opposite response through the judicial system. Lastly, let's go back to this case that was a narrative. And it may seem harsh. This guy, he blasphemes the name. God says put him to death. And you might say, wow, what's going on here? Well, we've been talking about holiness, right? We've had all these chapters on holiness. We had, here's how the people are to be holy. Here's how the priests are to be holy. Here's how the sacrifices are to be holy. Here's how the days are to be holy. And then you have an example that's not doing that. And God is saying, hey, the punishment is death. And that fits right in what we've seen in the Bible. That fits in with Genesis. That fits in actually later on with Romans. That fits with the whole Bible. The punishment for sin, for not being holy, is death. And of course, we can't measure up to that. And that's something that's going to become a question then as you read through this. Like, well, everyone really deserves this. Actually, everyone deserves this punishment. This guy got this punishment. It's not that he got the short end of the deal in some sense. It's that he got what he actually deserved. And so, how are we not going to get what we deserve? How are we not going to get that? What can we do to be redeemed? We need to be redeemed from our evil ways, and we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.